In 1995, the FBI thought they had the Mafia on the ropes. John Gotti was behind bars, and the tough guy era was over. They were wrong. While the feds were looking for dead bodies in Brooklyn construction sites, Sammy, the bull Gravano, was building a different kind of empire, one that didn't involve cement shoes or midnight burials in the Pine Barrens. This empire pulsed with neon lights, thumped with bass that you could feel in your chest, and smelled like sweat, cigarette smoke, and something chemical that the kids called freedom. The FBI had won the battle against the old Mafia, the men in expensive suits who shook down construction sites and ran numbers out of social clubs in Little Italy. But they were about to discover they had missed an entire war, one being fought not in back alleys but on dance floors, not with guns but with pills, not by men who looked like gangsters, but by promoters, bouncers and dealers who looked like everyone else in the crowd. The story of how Sammy Gravano pivoted the mob into the club and drug scene of the mid-90s is a masterclass in business adaptation, the kind that Harvard would never teach, but that every entrepreneur secretly wishes they understood. It reveals how organized crime saw the future before law enforcement did, how they recognized that the real money wasn't in the old rackets that had defined the Mafia since Prohibition, but in a new American hunger for escape, for chemical euphoria, for nights that erased the memory of day. This is the story of how the mob went from concrete and bullets to ecstasy and bass drops, from controlling unions to controlling nightclubs, from men who settled disputes with violence to men who understood that the real power was in controlling access to pleasure. It's a story about vision in the criminal underworld, about how Sammy Gravano looked at a warehouse full of sweating teenagers and saw what others couldn't see, a river of cash flow that made traditional mob rackets look like lemonade stands. Understanding this pivot requires us to decode not just the business model, but the psychology behind it, the way Gravano's mind worked differently from the old guard. While other mobsters were clinging to the rackets their fathers and grandfathers had run, Gravano was reading the culture like a book written in a language only he understood. He saw that America was changing, that the kids who would define the next decade didn't want what their parents wanted, didn't fear what their parents feared, didn't even respect the same symbols of power. The expensive suit and the threatening stare that worked on a construction foreman meant nothing to a 20-year-old graphic designer from Williamsburg who just wanted to dance until sunrise. Gravano understood this disconnect before anyone else in the mob did, and he built an empire on that understanding. The clubs themselves were the key, the physical spaces where this new economy operated. Places like the Tunnel, Limelight and Sound Factory weren't just venues. They were territories as valuable as any construction site or garbage route the mob had ever controlled, except the profit margins were higher, and the legal risks seemed lower. A construction racket might generate thousands a week through intimidation and payoffs. A nightclub could generate that in a single night, and the customers were willing participants, paying for the privilege of being there, buying overpriced drinks and, most importantly, creating the perfect environment for selling drugs that made them want to stay even longer, dance even harder, feel even more alive. The ecstasy trade was perfect for someone with Gravano's calculating mind. The pills were small, easy to transport, and didn't come with the same level of federal attention as heroin or cocaine. The users weren't desperate addicts breaking into cars to feed their habits. They were middle-class kids with disposable income, college students, young professionals, the kind of people who would never buy heroin but who saw ecstasy as harmless fun, a party drug, something that made the music better and the people around them seem more beautiful and interesting. The profit margins were astronomical. A pill that cost a few dollars to produce in a European lab could sell for $20 or $30 on a New York dance floor, and a decent dealer could move hundreds in a single night. Multiply that by dozens of dealers across multiple clubs, and you had revenue streams that made traditional mob businesses look primitive. But the real genius of the operation wasn't just in the drugs, it was in the control of the entire ecosystem. The mob didn't just sell ecstasy in the clubs, they controlled who got to sell in the clubs, who got past the velvet ropes, who got hired as security, who got the contracts to run the coat check and the bathroom attendants. They taxed every independent dealer who wanted to operate on their turf, collected tribute from club promoters who wanted their events to run smoothly, and made sure that any problems were handled quietly, without police involvement, which the club owners appreciated, because the last thing they wanted was cops shutting down their venues. This system required a different kind of mobster than the men who had built the 5 families. It required people who could talk to club owners and ravers as easily as they could talk to other criminals, who understood the aesthetics and culture of the scene they were exploiting, who knew the difference between house music and techno, and why that mattered to the crowds they were serving. Some of the younger guys in the crew adapted easily to this world. They started dressing like the people in the clubs, learning the language, becoming part of the scene rather than outsiders extracting tribute from it. Others struggled with the transition, couldn't wrap their minds around the idea that the real money was coming from kids who dressed in baggy pants and sucked on pacifiers. Before we continue, kindly subscribe to my channel and don't forget to turn on post notification, should in case I drop a new video you'd be notified. Alright, let's continue. Gravano himself never pretended to understand the culture. He didn't need to. He understood the numbers, the logistics, the supply chain, the profit and loss. He understood power structures and how to build them, how to identify bottlenecks and exploit them, how to turn chaos into cash flow. The rave scene in the mid-90s was chaos, a wild explosion of creative energy and hedonism that seemed to operate without rules. But chaos is just another word for opportunity when you know how to impose order on it, and that's exactly what the mob did. The Israel to Brooklyn pipeline was the artery that kept this heart pumping. While American law enforcement was focused on South American cocaine routes and Asian heroin networks, ecstasy was flowing into the country through routes and methods that barely registered on their radar. Israeli organized crime had become major players in the ecstasy trade, with labs in the Netherlands producing pills that were then distributed through networks that stretched across Europe and into North America. The connection between Israeli criminals and the Italian-American Mafia might seem unlikely, but crime has always been more international and pragmatic than the general public realizes. These weren't partnerships based on shared culture or friendship. They were business relationships based on mutual benefit, supply meeting demand, each side providing what the other needed. The pills would arrive in New York through various channels, sometimes in shipping containers mixed with legitimate goods, sometimes through couriers flying into JFK with suitcases full of product, sometimes through more creative methods that involved everything from diplomatic pouches to body packing. Once in New York, the distribution network took over, a pyramid structure that would be familiar to anyone who has studied corporate hierarchies or drug trafficking organizations. At the top were the people making the major decisions and taking the largest cuts. Below them were mid-level operators who interfaced with both the suppliers and the street-level dealers. And at the bottom were the actual dealers, the kids and young adults who stood on dance floors and in bathroom stalls, exchanging pills for cash hundreds of times a night. Security was crucial to making this system work. The clubs needed to feel safe enough that regular customers would keep coming back, but they also needed to be permissive enough that the drug trade could flourish. This balance required careful management. The bouncers and security staff, many of whom were on the mob payroll or were associates themselves, had to know the difference between someone who was there to have a good time and someone who was going to cause problems. They had to be able to identify undercover cops, handle violent drunks without creating scenes that would attract police attention, and make sure that the dealers operating inside the clubs were the ones paying tribute to the right people. The door policy was part of this security apparatus. Who got into the club wasn't just about aesthetics or creating a certain vibe, though those factors mattered to the club owners. It was also about control. The people manning the velvet ropes were screening for potential problems, turning away people who looked like trouble, making sure that rival dealers didn't get inside to poach customers or start conflicts. They were also creating artificial scarcity, making it hard enough to get in that being inside felt special, worth paying for, worth coming back to. The longer the line outside, the more desirable the club seemed, and the more the people inside were willing to spend. Inside the clubs, the experience was designed to maximize profit at every level. The lighting was deliberately dim in some areas, making it easier for transactions to happen without being observed by anyone who might care. The music was loud enough that conversations had to happen up close, creating intimacy and making it harder for anyone trying to monitor what was being said. The bathrooms were social spaces where deals went down and pills were consumed. The water was expensive, which mattered when you were selling a drug that made people overheat and desperately thirsty. Some club owners were knowing participants in this system, understanding exactly what was happening in their venues and taking their cut. Others preferred plausible deniability, collecting the profits from door charges and drink sales while pretending not to notice the obvious drug trade happening on their dance floors. The DJs and promoters were another piece of the puzzle. The right DJ could pack a club with exactly the kind of crowd that would spend money on ecstasy. The music itself was part of the drug experience. Electronic dance music, with its repetitive beats and building crescendos, was designed to sound better on ecstasy, to create waves of pleasure that matched the chemical waves washing through the brain. The promoters who could deliver these crowds became valuable assets, and some of them were either on the mob payroll or paying tribute for the privilege of throwing events in mob-controlled venues. The money had to be laundered, of course. Cash from drug sales can't just be deposited in banks without raising red flags. The clubs themselves provided one laundering mechanism. Cash-heavy businesses are perfect for mixing illegal and legal money. If a club reported selling $10,000 worth of drinks in a night, but had actually sold 6,000, the extra 4,000 could be drug money that was now laundered through the business. Multiply this across multiple venues operating every night of the week, and you had a sophisticated washing machine turning dirty money clean. Other businesses served similar purposes. Pizza places, delis, car washes, any business where cash transactions were normal, and it was hard to verify exactly how many customers came through on any given day. The mob had been using these techniques for decades, but the sheer volume of cash coming from the ecstasy trade required expanding the infrastructure. New businesses were opened, sometimes as legitimate operations that happened to also launder money, sometimes as pure fronts that existed only on paper or barely functioned as real businesses. The human cost of this empire was mostly invisible to the people running it. Ecstasy was marketed and perceived as a safe drug, less dangerous than heroin or cocaine, something that brought people together rather than destroying them. And compared to some drugs, that perception had some truth to it. Most people who took ecstasy at a club on Saturday night went to work on Monday morning without obvious problems, but ecstasy wasn't harmless. People died from overheating in crowded clubs, from drinking too much water in response to the thirst the drug created, from pills that contained dangerous adulterants or far more MDMA than users expected. People developed psychological problems from repeated use, found themselves depressed and anxious in the days following use, got addicted not to the chemical necessarily, but to the experience, to the feeling of being that happy and connected and free. The mob didn't care about these consequences any more than tobacco companies cared about lung cancer. They were providing a product that people wanted, and what people did with that product was their own business. This moral detachment was necessary for the operation to function. You couldn't think too hard about the 19-year-old who died in a hospital after taking a pill you sold, or the person who developed serotonin syndrome from taking too much too often, or the families worried about kids who went to clubs and came home with dilated pupils and clenched jaws. That kind of thinking was bad for business. But the law enforcement apparatus was starting to pay attention. The early 90s had been focused on crack cocaine and the violence associated with that trade. By the mid-90s, as the crack epidemic began to wane in some areas, and as the rave scene became more visible and mainstream, the DEA and FBI started looking more closely at ecstasy. They were learning about the supply chains, identifying the major players, building cases. The techniques that had worked to bring down the traditional mafia, the wiretaps and surveillance and informants, were being applied to this new empire. The problem for law enforcement was that this operation didn't look like traditional organized crime. There were no social clubs where the bosses met every day, no easily identifiable hierarchy, no recorded conversations about hits and tribute payments. The people selling ecstasy in clubs looked like everyone else in the clubs. The money was mixed with legitimate business income. The violence that made mob cases easier to prosecute was largely absent from the ecstasy trade. Disputes were usually settled with money or by cutting people out of the operation, not with guns. But the FBI had learned from their successes against the old mafia. They knew how to be patient, how to build cases slowly, how to find the weak links in an organization and apply pressure until those links broke. They started identifying dealers and offering them deals. They started surveilling club owners and promoters. They started following the money, looking for the laundering operations. They started connecting dots, building organizational charts, figuring out who reported to whom, who was making the real decisions, where the money was ultimately flowing. The club scene itself was changing in ways that would ultimately work against the mob's interests. As raves moved from underground spaces to larger commercial venues, they attracted more mainstream attention and more regulatory scrutiny. City officials who had ignored warehouse parties started paying attention when thousands of young people were gathering in Manhattan nightclubs every weekend. Parents who had never heard of Ecstasy started reading news stories about club drugs. The media began covering rave culture, and not always positively. Some of this coverage was sensationalized, moral panic about a new drug and a new subculture, but some of it was legitimate reporting on a real public health issue. Emergency rooms were seeing patients with problems related to ecstasy use. Doctors were trying to educate themselves about a drug they hadn't learned about in medical school. Public health officials were trying to figure out how to respond to a phenomenon that didn't fit the existing frameworks for drug prevention and treatment. The increased attention created pressure on city officials to do something, and what officials usually do is increase enforcement. Police started raiding clubs, making arrests, seizing drugs. Some clubs were shut down entirely. Others implemented stricter security measures, including drug dogs and searches that made it harder to bring pills inside. These measures cut into profits and made the whole operation riskier. At the same time, the rave scene was evolving culturally in ways that made it less amenable to mob control. The original spirit of raves had been inclusive and anti-commercial, about creating temporary autonomous zones where normal social rules didn't apply. As the scene became more commercial and corporate, some of the original participants moved on, looking for new underground spaces. This fragmentation made it harder to maintain centralized control over the scene. New players were entering the market too. Street gangs who had traditionally dealt crack and heroin saw the profits being made from ecstasy and wanted in. They brought different methods and different attitudes, more willing to use violence to establish territory. Less concerned about maintaining the low profile that had allowed the mob's operation to flourish. This created conflicts and complications, shootings outside clubs, rivalries that attracted exactly the kind of police attention that everyone involved wanted to avoid. The Israeli suppliers were facing their own problems. European law enforcement was cracking down on ecstasy production, shutting down labs, making arrests. The chemicals needed to produce MDMA were becoming harder to obtain as governments implemented tighter controls on precursor chemicals. The price of pills was going up, which cut into profit margins and made dealers more desperate and more likely to take risks. Within the mob itself, there were tensions about the direction of the organization. Some of the old-timers never liked the drug trade, saw it as dishonorable compared to traditional rackets, worried that it brought too much heat from the feds. They had seen what happened to other mob families that got heavily involved in drugs. The Pizza Connection case in the 80s had devastated the Bonanno family. The French Connection before that had brought down major players. Drugs meant mandatory minimum sentences that made cooperation more attractive. Drugs meant federal attention in ways that gambling and loan sharking often didn't. But the money from ecstasy was too good to walk away from, especially as other revenue streams were drying up. The construction rackets that had sustained the mob for decades were facing increased scrutiny and competition. Gambling was being legalized in various forms, from state lotteries to casinos on Indian reservations, cutting into the numbers and sports betting operations. Labor racketeering was harder as unions weakened and law enforcement got better at detecting and prosecuting it. The mob needed new sources of income, and the club scene provided exactly that. Gravano's position in all of this was complicated. By the mid-90s, he had already made the decision that would define the rest of his life, the decision to cooperate with the government and testify against John Gotti. This cooperation had put him in witness protection, supposedly removed from the life he had lived for decades, but the street doesn't work like that. Even in witness protection, even supposedly out of the game, a man like Gravano had connections, had people who were loyal to him, had knowledge and skills that could be applied to new opportunities. The exact details of how involved Gravano was in the ecstasy operation, while supposedly cooperating with the government, remain disputed. Some accounts suggest he was actively directing operations from Arizona, where he had been relocated. Others suggest that his former associates were using his name and reputation without his direct involvement, that the empire being built was more inspired by him than directed by him. The truth is probably somewhere in between, a grey area where plausible deniability met actual influence, where winks and nods substituted for direct orders. What's clear is that the organizational principles and business acumen that made Gravano successful in traditional mob rackets were perfectly applicable to the club drug trade. The same skills that let you run a construction racket, the ability to coordinate multiple people and operations, to manage risk, to identify and exploit opportunities, to maintain loyalty through a combination of reward and threat, could be applied to running a drug distribution network. The specifics were different, but the fundamentals were the same. The psychology of leadership in criminal organizations is worth examining. What makes someone effective at running an illegal enterprise? It's not just ruthlessness, though that helps. It's not just intelligence, though that's necessary. It's a particular combination of vision and practicality, the ability to see the big picture and identify opportunities while also managing the minute details of operations. It's the ability to inspire loyalty in people who have no reason to be loyal, except that it benefits them. It's the ability to make hard decisions quickly and live with the consequences. Gravano had all of these qualities. He was smart enough to see that the mob needed to evolve, practical enough to understand how to make that evolution profitable, and ruthless enough to do what was necessary to maintain control. He understood that respect in the criminal world came not from being the loudest or the flashiest, but from being effective, from making money, from solving problems. John Gotti had been all flash and headlines, expensive suits and publicity. Gravano was the opposite, deliberately low profile, focused on the business rather than the image. This low-profile, high-profit philosophy was perfect for the ecstasy trade. The whole point was to make money without attracting attention. The dealers in the clubs weren't supposed to look like dealers. The operation wasn't supposed to look like a mob operation. Everything was designed to blend in, to be part of the scene rather than obviously exploiting it. This required discipline and patience, qualities that some mobsters had and others didn't. The young guys coming up in the 90s sometimes lacked this discipline. They had grown up watching mob movies, absorbing a glamorized version of the life that emphasized the surface-level trappings rather than the actual work. They wanted the respect and the money without understanding that both came from being smart and careful and thinking long-term. Some of them were flashy when they should have been quiet, violent when they should have been diplomatic, greedy when they should have been patient. These younger mobsters were both an asset and a liability. They brought energy and connections to the club scene that the older guys didn't have. They understood the culture in ways that 50-year-old men never could, but they also took risks that more experienced criminals would have avoided. They talked too much, spent too obviously created drama that attracted attention. Managing these young guys, keeping them productive while preventing them from destroying the whole operation, was a constant challenge. The structure of the organization had to adapt to this new kind of business. Traditional mob hierarchies were based on the idea that information flowed up and orders flowed down, that the bosses made decisions and the soldiers executed them. But the club drug trade required more flexibility and autonomy. The dealers on the ground had to be able to make decisions in real time, to respond to changing conditions, to identify opportunities and problems. Too much centralized control would make the operation rigid and slow. Too little control would lead to chaos and people pursuing their own interests at the expense of the organization. Finding the right balance required trust, which was always complicated in criminal organizations. How do you trust people when everyone involved is by definition willing to break the law, when the only thing preventing betrayal is self-interest and fear? The traditional mob answer was blood ties and long history. You trusted your relatives and people you had known since childhood, people who had demonstrated loyalty over decades. But the ecstasy operation couldn't rely solely on these traditional relationships. It needed people who were connected to the club scene, and those people weren't necessarily Italian-American men from Brooklyn with family ties to the mob. So other mechanisms of control had to be used. Money was the obvious one. Pay people well enough and they have an incentive to keep the operation running smoothly. But money alone isn't enough because there's always the possibility that someone else will pay more, or that the government will offer a deal that's worth more than any amount of criminal income. Fear was another tool. Make it clear that betrayal had consequences, that stealing or cooperating with law enforcement would be met with violence. But fear also has limitations. Too much fear and people stop being effective, become paralyzed or desperate, make stupid mistakes. The most effective control was actually the structure of the operation itself. If you set things up so that no one person knew too much, so that dealers didn't know suppliers and suppliers didn't know the ultimate destination of the money, then no single person could bring down the whole operation, even if they wanted to. This compartmentalization was standard practice in intelligence agencies and drug trafficking organizations, and it worked for the same reason in both contexts. Information is power, and limiting who has information limits who has the power to destroy you. The club owners occupied an interesting position in this ecosystem. Some of them were actively complicit, knowing exactly what was happening in their venues and facilitating it. Others were more passive, willfully blind to the obvious drug trade, but happy to collect the profits that came from having popular clubs. And some were actually trying to keep drugs out of their clubs, but finding it almost impossible to do so given the demand and the determination of the dealers. From the mob's perspective, having the club owner on board made everything easier. If the owner was cooperative, you could coordinate security, make sure your people were the ones checking IDs and manning the doors, ensure that police weren't being called for minor incidents. If the owner was resistant, you had to work around them, which was doable but more complicated and risky. The ideal situation was an owner who understood that cooperation was in everyone's interest, who saw the mob not as an enemy, but as a partner in the business of making money from New York nightlife. The economics of running a major nightclub in New York in the mid-90s were brutal. Real estate was expensive, liquor licenses were hard to get, competition was fierce, trends changed quickly. A club that was hot one month could be empty the next. The margins on alcohol were good but not amazing, especially when you factored in all the overhead. Most clubs made their real money from door charges and special events, and those depended on being able to consistently draw crowds. The drug trade helped solve this problem. If your club was known as a place where you could reliably get good ecstasy, you had a competitive advantage over other clubs. Ravers would seek out your venue specifically because they knew they could get what they wanted there. This created a positive feedback loop where the drugs brought the crowds, and the crowds created the environment where drugs could be sold, which brought more crowds. The club owner might not like that this was how their business worked, but they couldn't deny that it was effective. The promoters who threw events in these clubs were often the real customer acquisition channel. A good promoter had a mailing list, connections with DJs, relationships with the core crowd that would show up early and stay late. They could pack a club with exactly the right people, the ones who would spend money and create the atmosphere that attracted even more people. The mob recognized that promoters were valuable assets and cultivated relationships with the successful ones, offering protection and support in exchange for loyalty and a cut of the profits. Some promoters were themselves dealers or had dealers working for them. Others maintained separation, focusing on the event production side, while understanding that drug sales were part of the ecosystem. The best promoters understood the full spectrum of what made a successful night, from the music to the lighting to the vibe to the availability of drugs. They thought about the customer experience holistically, recognizing that people came to raves for a complete experience, not just to listen to music or just to take drugs, but to have a transcendent social experience that combined all these elements. The transcendence part was real, not just marketing. For many people, the rave scene represented something genuinely meaningful, a community and culture that felt more authentic and accepting than mainstream society. The drugs were part of that experience but not the whole of it. The music created altered states even without chemicals. The dancing was a form of meditation. The sense of connection with strangers on the dance floor was something people chased because it felt like a glimpse of how human society could be if we weren't all so isolated and defended all the time. The mob couldn't have created this culture. That's important to understand. They didn't invent raves or electronic music or the desire for ecstatic experience. What they did was recognize an existing phenomenon and figure out how to extract profit from it. They were parasites on a host organism, taking resources from a living system without contributing to its creation or health. This is what organized crime does. It doesn't build things. It finds things that other people built and figures out how to take a cut. But parasites can kill their hosts if they're not careful, and the mob's increasing control over the club scene was starting to damage the very culture they were profiting from. As clubs became more commercial and more controlled, they lost some of the spontaneous creative energy that had made them special in the first place. The music got more predictable. The crowds got less diverse. The experience started to feel manufactured rather than authentic. Some of the original ravers stopped going to big commercial clubs and started looking for smaller underground events again, recreating the dynamic that had birthed the scene in the first place. This cycle of underground culture becoming commercial and then participants abandoning it for new underground spaces is a pattern that repeats throughout cultural history. It happened with jazz and rock and hip-hop. It was happening with rave culture in the 90s. And the mob's involvement accelerated the process because their presence made the scene more commercial and controlled by definition. You can't have authentic, spontaneous culture when there are people in the room whose job is to extract maximum profit from every interaction. The violence that occasionally erupted in and around clubs was another factor that hurt the scene. Most nights were peaceful, just people dancing and having a good time. But when there was violence, it was often spectacular and attention-getting. Shootings outside clubs made headlines. Stabbings inside clubs led to closures. Every violent incident gave ammunition to the people who wanted to shut down the whole scene, who saw rave culture as dangerous and drug-fueled and harmful to young people. Some of this violence was related to the drug trade, disputes over territory or money or respect. Some of it was just the kind of random violence that happens when you put thousands of young people in a dark space and add alcohol and drugs and loud music. The mob tried to minimize this violence because it was bad for business, but they couldn't eliminate it entirely. And when they did use violence themselves to solve problems, they contributed to the very thing they were trying to prevent. The relationship between the mob and the police was complex during this period. The NYPD had bigger problems than ecstasy in nightclubs. Violent crime was still high in the mid-90s, though starting to decline from the peaks of the early 90s. Resources were focused on guns and gangs and the crack trade. Ecstasy was often a low priority, something that generated occasional enforcement actions, but not the kind of sustained attention that could shut down a major operation. But there were cops who cared about the club scene, either because they saw the harm being done or because they were getting pressure from politicians and community groups. These cops started building cases, learning about the scene, identifying the major players. Some of them went undercover, posing as ravers or dealers or club staff. Some of them cultivated informants, finding people who were willing to provide information in exchange for leniency on their own charges. The mob had informants too, people in positions to know when police were planning raids or building cases, corrupt cops who would provide information for money, club staff who would warn dealers when they spotted someone who looked like a cop. This information network wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to prevent most surprises, to know when to pull back and when to push forward. The year 1995 was pivotal for multiple reasons. Gotti had been in prison for 3 years. The other families were still recovering from the prosecution wave that had decimated their leadership in the 80s. There was a power vacuum in the New York underworld, and multiple factions were competing to fill it. The ecstasy trade was one battleground in this larger war. Some mob factions saw drugs as the future and were investing heavily in the trade. Others were more conservative, sticking with traditional rackets and viewing the drug trade with suspicion. This internal debate about the direction of organized crime had been happening for decades and would continue for decades more. But in the mid-90s it was particularly acute because the old ways were clearly dying and the new ways weren't yet established. The Russian mob was also becoming a factor in New York during this period. Russian organized crime had different structures and methods than the Italian Mafia, less bound by tradition and codes, more willing to engage in extreme violence, more connected to international criminal networks. The Russians saw opportunities in the same places the Italian mob did, in clubs and drugs and money laundering. Sometimes they cooperated with the Italians, sometimes they competed. The relationship was fluid and pragmatic, based on circumstances rather than principle. The Israeli criminals who supplied ecstasy had connections to both Russian and Italian organized crime. They were brokers and middlemen, moving product and money across international boundaries, operating in the gaps between legal jurisdictions. They weren't loyal to any particular group. They sold to whoever had money and connections. This made them valuable partners, but also potentially dangerous, because their loyalty lasted only as long as the business relationship was profitable. Understanding the international dimensions of the ecstasy trade requires understanding how globalization was changing organized crime. The same forces that were creating global supply chains for legitimate businesses were creating global supply chains for illegal businesses. Improved transportation and communication made it easier to coordinate criminal activity across continents. The collapse of the Soviet Union had created chaos in Eastern Europe that criminal organizations exploited. The European Union's open borders made it easier to move drugs and money across countries. The pills themselves had to be manufactured somewhere, and that somewhere was usually the Netherlands or Belgium, where chemical expertise and relatively tolerant drug policies created an environment where ecstasy production could flourish. The labs were sophisticated operations run by people with chemistry backgrounds, capable of producing hundreds of thousands of pills. The ingredients came from various sources, precursor chemicals diverted from legitimate pharmaceutical production or synthesized in other underground labs. The pill presses were industrial equipment, sometimes stolen, sometimes purchased through shell companies. From the production labs, the pills would begin their journey to consumers, moving through multiple hands and crossing multiple borders. Each transfer point added risk and cost. Each middleman took a cut. By the time a pill reached a dance floor in New York, it might have passed through 10 different people and traveled 5,000 miles. The markup at each stage meant that a pill that cost $2 to produce might sell for $30 to the final customer, creating enormous profits distributed among everyone involved in the supply chain. The logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of pills across international borders required creativity and boldness. Commercial shipping was one method, pills hidden in containers of legitimate goods, hoping that customs inspectors wouldn't find them. Couriers flying with pills in their luggage or on their bodies was another method, risky for the couriers, but effective if they weren't caught. Private planes and boats were used for larger shipments, flying or sailing to remote locations where border security was minimal. Inside the United States, the distribution network spread out from major entry points like New York and Miami to cities across the country. The rave scene was national, with clubs and parties in every major city and many smaller ones. Each market had its own dynamics and its own players, but they were all connected through the supply chain that ultimately led back to the production labs in Europe and the importers who brought the pills to America. The money flowed in the opposite direction, from consumers to dealers to mid-level distributors to major suppliers, and ultimately to the people running the labs and the criminal organizations that controlled them. This reverse supply chain was arguably more important than the product supply chain because it was the money that made everything work. And moving large amounts of cash was often harder than moving drugs because cash is heavy and bulky and suspicious. Money laundering methods ranged from crude to sophisticated. The crudest was simply spending the cash on consumer goods and trying to stay under the radar of authorities. More sophisticated was moving the money through various businesses, mixing it with legitimate income, creating paper trails that made it hard to prove the money came from drugs. The most sophisticated involved international wire transfers through shell companies and banks in countries with lax regulation, transforming dirty cash into clean money in foreign accounts. The lawyers and accountants who facilitated this money laundering were essential, but often willfully ignorant participants. They set up the corporate structures and handled the paperwork without asking too many questions about where the money came from. Some of them knew exactly what they were doing and charged accordingly. Others maintained plausible deniability, following the letter of the law while enabling criminal activity. The culture of the mob itself was changing during this period in ways that would have long-term consequences. The old codes and traditions that had governed mob behavior for generations were eroding. The idea of omerta, the code of silence that said you never cooperated with law enforcement no matter what, had been shattered by high-profile cooperators like Gravano himself. If an underboss could flip, then anyone could flip. This created paranoia and distrust that made it harder to run criminal organizations. The younger generation of mobsters had grown up in a different world than their fathers and grandfathers. They had seen mob guys on television and in movies, had absorbed a pop culture version of the life that emphasized money and power and excitement. They often lacked the discipline and patience of earlier generations, wanted quick scores and immediate gratification. This made them useful for certain kinds of operations, but dangerous for long-term organizational stability. The ecstasy trade attracted this younger generation because it felt modern and lucrative, and less violent than traditional rackets. You could make a lot of money without killing anyone, without the constant risk of being killed yourself. This appealed to people who wanted the mobster lifestyle without all the mobster problems, but it was a false promise because the consequences of getting caught in a major drug conspiracy were severe, often worse than the consequences for other mob crimes. The federal sentencing guidelines for drug offenses were harsh in the 90s, part of the war on drugs that had created mandatory minimum sentences and eliminated parole. Someone convicted of distributing large quantities of ecstasy could face 20 years or more in federal prison. These long sentences were designed to deter drug trafficking, but they also created enormous pressure to cooperate. When you're facing 2 decades in prison, suddenly cooperation starts to look a lot more attractive. The FBI and DEA understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. They would arrest lower-level dealers and offer them deals if they would provide information about their suppliers. The dealers would flip, giving up the mid-level distributors. The mid-level distributors would then flip on the major suppliers. The major suppliers might eventually flip on the people at the very top. This chain of cooperation could dismantle an entire organization if law enforcement was patient and strategic about how they brought cases. The early investigations into the ecstasy trade were often frustrating for law enforcement because they didn't understand how the scene worked. Cops who had spent their careers dealing with heroin and cocaine didn't know what to make of clubs full of teenagers sucking on pacifiers. The culture seemed alien, and the participants seemed like victims rather than criminals. But as law enforcement educated themselves about ecstasy and its effects and its distribution networks, they became more effective at investigating and prosecuting cases. The breakthrough often came from small cases that led to bigger cases. A street-level dealer getting arrested might provide information that led to a club dealer. The club dealer might lead to a distributor. The distributor might lead to an importer. And the importer might lead to international suppliers and the organizations behind them. Building these cases took years of patient investigation, surveillance, wiretaps, undercover work, and cooperation from multiple agencies across multiple jurisdictions. The wiretaps were particularly valuable because they allowed law enforcement to hear criminal conspiracies being discussed in real time. The old mob had learned to be careful on phones, speaking in code and avoiding detailed discussions of criminal activity. But the ecstasy dealers were often less cautious, younger and less experienced, talking openly about pills and money and distribution. These recorded conversations became evidence that could prove conspiracy charges and implicate multiple people in a single conversation. Physical surveillance was harder in the club context because the environments were dark and crowded and chaotic. But law enforcement developed techniques, using cameras and undercover officers and informants wearing wires. They learned to identify the patterns of drug deals, the hand signals and subtle movements that preceded a transaction. They documented who was talking to whom, building network maps that showed the structure of the organization. The informants were the most valuable resource and the most complicated to manage. Someone who agrees to provide information to law enforcement is by definition untrustworthy, willing to betray the people they work with to save themselves. They might be telling the truth, or they might be lying to make themselves look less culpable. They might be exaggerating or inventing things to make their information seem more valuable. Law enforcement had to verify everything an informant said, corroborating it with other evidence before relying on it for charges. Some informants were motivated by self-preservation, cooperating only to avoid or reduce their own punishment. Others were motivated by money, paid by law enforcement for their information. And some were motivated by genuine remorse or anger at the organization they had been part of, wanting to bring down people who had wronged them or seeing their cooperation as a form of redemption. Understanding what motivated an informant was crucial to understanding how reliable they were likely to be. The defense lawyers representing people charged in ecstasy conspiracies faced difficult challenges. The evidence was often overwhelming, between wiretaps and surveillance and cooperating witnesses. The sentences were severe if their clients were convicted. The only real option was often to negotiate the best plea deal possible, trying to get cooperation credit for their client by having them provide information to prosecutors. This created a cascade effect where each person who pled guilty and cooperated increased the pressure on everyone else to do the same. The trials that did happen were complex affairs, often involving multiple defendants and months of testimony. Juries had to understand the ecstasy trade, the supply chains, the distribution networks, the roles different people played. Prosecutors used charts and timelines and expert witnesses to explain the organization. Defense attorneys tried to raise doubts about the credibility of cooperating witnesses and the reliability of surveillance evidence. The outcomes could determine whether someone spent the rest of their life in prison or went free, which created enormous pressure on everyone involved. The culture clash between the legal system and the rave scene was sometimes surreal. Prosecutors who had to describe club culture to middle-aged jurors struggled to convey the atmosphere and appeal of raves to people who had never experienced anything like them. Defense attorneys tried to argue that their clients were just part of a scene, not criminals running major drug operations. The gap between how ravers saw themselves and how the legal system saw them was vast, and bridging that gap was essential to getting convictions. The club owners who got caught up in these prosecutions often faced a dilemma. They could claim ignorance of the drug trade happening in their venues, but that claim became harder to maintain when the evidence showed dealers operating openly and security staff facilitating rather than preventing drug sales. They could admit knowledge but claim they were powerless to stop it, but that raised questions about why they didn't close their clubs or call police. The truth was often that they had made a calculated decision, that the profits from allowing the drug trade outweighed the risks, and that calculation had proven wrong. The media coverage of ecstasy cases contributed to moral panic about rave culture. News stories focused on deaths and overdoses, interviewing grieving parents and showing footage of crowded clubs. The stories rarely captured the nuance of the situation, the fact that millions of people took ecstasy without serious problems, that the vast majority of rave participants were responsible people who held jobs and went to school. The coverage reinforced stereotypes and made it easier for prosecutors to convince juries that the people they were prosecuting were dangerous criminals rather than participants in a subculture. Politicians responded to this media coverage with calls for tougher enforcement and stricter regulations on clubs. Some cities implemented laws that made club owners legally responsible for drug activity in their venues, even if they weren't directly involved. Other cities used zoning laws and licensing requirements to make it harder for clubs to operate. These measures were often effective at reducing visible drug activity, but they didn't eliminate demand, they just pushed it into less regulated spaces where the dangers were often greater. The harm reduction movement tried to offer an alternative approach, arguing that since people were going to take ecstasy regardless of the legal risks, the focus should be on making that use as safe as possible. Harm reduction advocates called for things like providing free water at clubs to prevent dehydration, allowing rest areas where people could cool down, distributing information about safe drug use, and even pill testing so users could know what they were actually taking. This approach was controversial because it seemed to tacitly accept illegal drug use rather than trying to prevent it. Most club owners weren't willing to implement harm reduction measures because doing so seemed to acknowledge that drug use was happening in their venues, which could expose them to legal liability. The few who did try to make their clubs safer often faced resistance from law enforcement, who saw harm reduction as enabling drug use rather than preventing harm. This created a situation where the venues where ecstasy was being consumed were often the least safe environments possible, dark and hot, and crowded with no water and no cool-down space, and no accurate information about what people were taking. The pills themselves varied wildly in quality and composition. Some were pure MDMA, producing the effects users wanted with minimal side effects. Others were mixed with adulterants like caffeine or methamphetamine or DXM, creating different and often more dangerous effects. Some pills contained little or no MDMA at all, just cheaper substitutes that dealers sold as ecstasy to unsuspecting buyers. This inconsistency meant that users never really knew what they were taking, which turned every use into a gamble. The people producing pills had no quality control incentives. They weren't going to get sued if their product was dangerous. They weren't going to lose customers because brand loyalty didn't work the same way in illegal drug markets. Their incentive was to produce pills as cheaply as possible and sell as many as possible before law enforcement shut them down. This led to corner cutting and adulteration that increased risks for users. The health consequences of ecstasy use were hotly debated during this period. Some research suggested that MDMA could cause permanent brain damage, depleting serotonin and causing long-term depression and cognitive problems. Other research suggested these effects were less severe than initially thought, that most users recovered fully after stopping use. The truth was probably that ecstasy was harmful in ways that varied depending on dose and frequency and individual biology, but the exact nature of the harm was still being figured out. What was clear was that some people died from taking ecstasy, and those deaths were tragic and preventable. Some died from overheating in crowded clubs, dancing for hours without rest or water. Some died from drinking too much water in response to thirst, causing hyponatremia. Some died from pre-existing conditions that the drug exacerbated. Some died from taking too much or taking pills that contained dangerous adulterants. Each death was a person, someone with family and friends and a future, and reducing them to statistics in debates about drug policy missed the human cost of the ecstasy trade. The mob didn't think about these deaths much, if at all. They were in the business of making money, and people dying was just a cost of doing business, an acceptable level of collateral damage. This might seem callous, but it's how all successful drug trafficking organizations think. You can't be sentimental about your customers when your business is selling them substances that might kill them. You have to maintain emotional distance or you can't function. This emotional distance was easier for some people than others. The higher up the organization you were, the further removed from the actual harm your business caused, the easier it was to rationalize what you were doing. The people running the operation never saw the person collapsing on the dance floor or the family crying in the hospital. They just saw numbers, profits and losses and market share. The dealers actually selling pills to people had a harder time maintaining that distance, but most of them managed by telling themselves that people were making their own choices and would get drugs from someone regardless. The argument that prohibition causes more harm than the drugs themselves had some merit in this context. If ecstasy were legal and regulated, the pills would be consistent in quality and dose. They would be sold in safer environments with accurate information about risks and effects. Deaths from overheating and dehydration would be less common if clubs could openly implement harm reduction measures without fear of legal consequences. The violence associated with the black market would disappear. The criminal organizations profiting from the trade would lose a major revenue source. But legalization wasn't politically viable in the mid-90s. The drug war was in full swing, and the idea of legalizing a drug associated with youth culture and party scenes was a non-starter for most politicians. Even harm reduction was controversial, seen as too soft on drugs by many voters. So prohibition continued, and with it all the harms that prohibition created, the violence and uncertainty and criminalization of users and enrichment of criminal organizations. The cycle was vicious and self-perpetuating. Prohibition created a black market. The black market was lucrative, attracting criminal organizations. The criminal organizations used violence and corruption to protect their market share. The violence and corruption justified more prohibition and enforcement. More enforcement raised the profits for those who weren't caught, attracting more criminals. And round it went, with no end in sight except perhaps the same end that came to alcohol prohibition, the eventual recognition that the cure was worse than the disease. But that recognition was decades away in the mid-90s. What was happening instead was an escalation on both sides. Law enforcement was getting better at investigating and prosecuting ecstasy cases. The criminal organizations were adapting their methods to evade detection. The pills kept flowing, and the money kept flowing in the opposite direction, and young people kept dancing in dark clubs, and some of them kept dying, and families kept grieving, and politicians kept promising to get tough on drugs, and the whole machine kept grinding forward. The human stories within this larger story were often heartbreaking. Young people who got involved in dealing because they needed money or because it seemed exciting, who thought they could make some quick cash and get out, who ended up facing federal charges and spending years in prison. Families torn apart by addiction or incarceration or death. Club owners who lost everything when their venues were shut down or seized. Legitimate business people who got caught up in money laundering schemes and lost their freedom and their reputations. And also success stories, or what passed for success stories in the criminal world. People who made hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars and got out before they got caught, who laundered their money successfully and went legitimate. People who got arrested but cooperated and received light sentences and started new lives. People who survived the scene and went on to do other things, carrying the memories and lessons of that era into whatever came next. The cultural legacy of the mid-90s rave scene is complicated. On one hand, It was a moment of creative explosion and genuine community, when electronic music went mainstream and dance culture became a global phenomenon. The fashion and art and music from that era influenced everything that came after. On the other hand, it was also a cautionary tale about what happens when criminal organizations co-opt and commercialize underground culture, when profits become more important than people, when hedonism curdles into exploitation. The Tunnel, Limelight, Sound Factory, these clubs became legendary not just because of the music or the crowds, but because of what they represented, a moment when New York nightlife was the center of global club culture. People from around the world came to experience these clubs, to be part of something that felt historic and transformative. And underneath it all was this criminal infrastructure extracting value from every transaction, every moment of joy and connection and transcendence. Looking back now, it's easy to judge the people involved, to condemn the dealers and the mobsters, and even the users who created demand for the product. But judgment doesn't help us understand what actually happened or why. Understanding requires empathy even for people who did harmful things, requires recognizing that everyone involved was operating within structures and incentives that shaped their choices in powerful ways. The mob guys who ran the Ecstasy operation weren't monsters. They were people who had grown up in a culture that glorified the criminal life, who saw opportunities and took them, who applied skills they had learned in one context to a new context. Some of them were probably sociopaths who didn't care about the harm they caused, but most were probably just pragmatic businessmen who happened to work in an illegal business, who rationalized their choices the way all of us rationalize our choices. The dealers were often users themselves, part of the scene they were selling drugs in, people who loved the music and the culture and saw dealing as a way to pay for their own drug use and fund their own good times. Some of them were supporting serious habits. Others were just trying to get free pills. The line between being a participant in the culture and being someone exploiting the culture was blurry and subjective. The users themselves bore some responsibility for creating demand, but criminalizing them never made sense from a harm reduction perspective. They weren't victims, but they also weren't criminals in any meaningful sense. They were mostly young people experimenting and seeking pleasure and connection, doing what young people have always done, but with the particular tools available in their time and place. And law enforcement was doing what law enforcement does, trying to enforce the laws as written, even when those laws created as many problems as they solved. Individual cops and prosecutors weren't responsible for drug policy. They were implementing policy decided by politicians responding to voter preferences and moral panics and their own ideological commitments. So blame is diffuse and shared, which doesn't make the harm any less real, but does make simple narratives of good guys and bad guys inadequate for understanding what happened. The reality was complexity and contradiction, people doing terrible things for understandable reasons, policies created with good intentions having devastating consequences, a system that benefited almost no one except the people making money from it. The story of Sammy Gravano and the Ecstasy empire is ultimately a story about American capitalism operating in an illegal space. All the things that make businesses successful in legitimate markets, identifying opportunities, understanding customer needs, building efficient distribution networks, managing risk, inspiring loyalty, these same things made criminal enterprises successful. The skills were transferable. The logic was the same. The only difference was that one operated within the law and one operated outside it. This parallel between legal and illegal business was something the mob had always understood. They called themselves businessmen, and in many ways they were right. They provided goods and services that people wanted. They operated according to rational economic principles. They responded to market signals. They competed for market share. That the government said their business was illegal didn't change the fundamental economic dynamics. But there were differences too, important ones. Legal businesses operate under rules that constrain their behavior in ways that benefit society. They can't use violence to eliminate competitors. They can't sell dangerous products without disclosure. They have to pay taxes and follow regulations. These constraints exist because pure unfettered capitalism leads to monopolies and fraud and exploitation and harm. Criminal enterprises face none of these constraints except the risk of law enforcement, and that risk is just another cost of doing business. The Ecstasy empire that flourished in the mid-90s was capitalism without rules, entrepreneurship without ethics, business success without social responsibility. It generated enormous profits by selling a product that people wanted but couldn't legally buy, and it did so without regard for the consequences. That it was run by mobsters rather than corporations didn't change the essential nature of what it was, which was exploitation for profit. That's all got today. If this story is something you look forward to getting from this channel, do well by subscribing and comment what topic you want us to treat next time. Also, where are you watching from? I'll see you in my next video.